They laughed when Ethan Walker handed over every dollar he had for a ruined mill at the edge of Blackwater Creek. But no one was laughing 3 months later. The old building stood alone beneath a gray Montana sky, its weathered boards leaning against time, its broken water wheel frozen in place like a forgotten relic from another century. Most people in town called it worthless. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed the river beneath it carried secrets best left buried. Ethan did not believe in curses. After years of sleeping in the cab of an aging pickup truck with only his German Shepherd, Ranger, beside him, he had stopped believing in most things. Yet something about the abandoned mill felt different. The air around it carried a strange stillness, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Late that first evening, as golden light faded beyond the pine-covered hills, Ethan sat on the mill's sagging porch listening to the creek murmur through the darkness. Ranger rested quietly beside him until suddenly the dog lifted his head. His ears stood rigid. His amber eyes locked onto the slow-moving water below. Then he rose and stepped toward the broken wheel. Not barking, not growling, simply listening. Ethan followed his gaze. At first he heard nothing. Then, somewhere beneath the endless whisper of the river, a faint metallic sound echoed through the earth below the mill. A single distant knock, followed by silence. The sound vanished so quickly that Ethan wondered if exhaustion had played a trick on him. He remained still on the porch, staring into the darkness beyond the creek while the cool night air carried the scent of damp timber and river stone. Ranger did not move. The German Shepherd stood beside the broken water wheel with his head slightly tilted, listening with an intensity that made Ethan uneasy. Over the years, he had learned to trust the dog. Ranger had sensed approaching storms before clouds appeared. He had found lost hikers hidden deep in mountain forests. He had even alerted Ethan to a leaking propane tank at a remote campsite long before anyone noticed the danger. When Ranger paid attention to something, there was usually a reason. Ethan rose slowly and walked across the uneven ground toward the wheel. The ancient structure groaned softly beneath the weight of years. Moonlight slipped through gaps in the weathered boards, painting pale silver lines across the earth. The creek flowed steadily beneath the mill, its black surface reflecting fragments of starlight. Ranger stepped closer to the water and lowered his nose. For several seconds, he remained motionless. Then the dog glanced back at Ethan as if waiting for him to understand something that could not yet be explained. Ethan crouched beside him. The metallic sound did not return. Only the endless whisper of water moving over stone. He shook his head and smiled faintly. "You hear things I cannot, buddy." Ranger blinked, but kept watching the current. Long after midnight, Ethan settled inside the mill. The upper floor was little more than a single room surrounded by warped beams and cracked walls. He had managed to clear enough space for a sleeping bag, a lantern, and a small camp stove. The place smelled of old pine, rust, and forgotten years. Wind slipped through the gaps in the siding, creating soft whistles that rose and faded like distant voices. Ethan lay awake staring at the ceiling. Sleep never came easily. Some nights memories arrived uninvited. Other nights, it was simply the silence. Tonight it was something else. Curiosity. The feeling that the mill was hiding a story. Just before dawn, a faint sound pulled him from a shallow sleep. Tap. Ethan opened his eyes. The room was gray with early morning light. Tap. This time he sat upright. Ranger was already awake. The dog stood near the far wall, ears forward, tail still. Tap. The sound seemed to come from somewhere below the floorboards. Not loud, not threatening, just deliberate. Ethan grabbed the lantern and crossed the room. The old planks creaked beneath his boots. Ranger moved ahead of him and stopped near a section of floor close to the eastern wall. There, the dog lowered one paw onto the wood and looked up. Ethan raised the lantern. At first, everything appeared ordinary. Then he noticed something strange. One narrow section of flooring was darker than the surrounding boards, as though it had been replaced many years after the mill was built. He knelt beside it and brushed away decades of dust. Beneath the grime, barely visible in the wood, was a carved symbol. A circle crossed by a winding line that looked remarkably like the shape of Blackwater Creek itself. Ethan stared at it in silence while morning light slowly filled the room. Somewhere below his hand, hidden beneath the aging floor, something waited. For the rest of that morning, Ethan could think about little else. Sunlight spilled through the mill's cracked windows, filling the dusty interior with narrow beams of gold that drifted through the air like silent ghosts. Outside, Blackwater Creek moved steadily past the old foundation stones, carrying the soft scent of pine and cold mountain water. Ranger remained close to the marked section of flooring, returning to it again and again as though an invisible thread connected him to whatever lay beneath. Ethan examined the carved symbol more carefully. The circle was worn smooth with age, but the winding line crossing through it remained visible. It looked deliberate, not decorative, like a marker left by someone who expected another person to find it someday. He fetched a pry bar from his truck and returned to the room. Kneeling beside the darker boards, he worked carefully, unwilling to damage anything hidden below. The wood resisted at first, swollen from decades of moisture and neglect. Then, with a long groan, one of the planks shifted. Dust erupted into the air. Ranger immediately stepped closer. Ethan removed another board, and then another until a narrow opening appeared beneath the floor. Cool air drifted upward from the darkness below. It carried a faint mineral scent unlike the smell of the mill itself. Ethan lowered the lantern into the opening. The light revealed a shallow cavity no more than 3 feet deep. At first glance it appeared empty except for dirt, stone, and cobwebs. Then he noticed something tucked against the far side. A small metal box covered in rust. His pulse quickened. Carefully, he reached down and lifted it free. The hinges protested when he opened it. Inside was no treasure, no gold, no stack of forgotten cash. Instead, he found a collection of old papers wrapped in oilcloth, a tarnished pocket watch, and a brass key unlike any he had seen before. The key was unusually long and heavy, with strange markings engraved along its shaft. Ethan turned it in the lantern light while Ranger watched silently. The papers proved even more intriguing. Most were damaged by time, but one folded document remained readable. It appeared to be a hand-drawn map. Blackwater Creek was clearly visible, winding through the valley exactly as it did today. The mill had been marked with a small black circle. Yet another location farther upstream had been highlighted in red ink. Beside it, written in careful handwriting faded by decades, were 4 words. The river remembers everything. Ethan stared at the message. A chill moved through him despite the warmth of the afternoon. It felt less like a note and more like a warning. Later that day, he drove into town hoping to learn something about the mill's history. Most people offered little help. The building had stood abandoned longer than many residents had been alive. Some shrugged. Others laughed. A few suggested he should sell the place before it collapsed completely. But as Ethan prepared to leave the general store, an elderly woman seated near the front window called his name. He stopped, surprised she knew who he was. Her silver hair caught the afternoon sunlight, and her pale blue eyes seemed unusually sharp. She glanced toward the map protruding from his jacket pocket and grew quiet. Then she spoke softly. "You found something beneath the floor, did you not?" Ethan froze. The woman looked toward the distant hills beyond town. "If the creek has started speaking to you," she said, "then the story is beginning again." The woman introduced herself as Eleanor Whitaker. She was 82 years old and had spent her entire life in Blackwater Valley. Her hands rested calmly on a wooden cane polished smooth by decades of use. Yet there was nothing fragile about the way she carried herself. She spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who had watched generations come and go while the mountains remained unchanged. Ethan sat across from her near the general store window while Ranger stretched out beside his chair, though the dog never took his eyes off her. Outside, late afternoon sunlight washed over the town's empty streets, turning the old brick buildings amber and gold. "The mill belonged to the Holloway family," Eleanor said softly. "Most people remember the building. Few remember the man." Ethan listened carefully. Eleanor explained that nearly 80 years earlier, a man named Samuel Holloway had operated the mill. He was respected throughout the valley for his honesty and hard work. Then one autumn, he vanished without warning. No farewell. No explanation. One day he was there. The next, he was simply gone. People searched for answers, Eleanor continued. But answers never came. She glanced toward the mountains beyond town. Only stories. Ethan reached into his jacket and unfolded the map. The old paper crackled gently between his fingers. Eleanor studied it for several seconds. Her expression changed. Not fear. Recognition. "I have not seen that mark in over 60 years, she whispered. Her finger touched the red location drawn upstream. My father showed me something similar when I was a little girl. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. What is it? Eleanor looked down at Ranger. The dog had risen quietly and was staring at the map. A place Samuel called the listening point. The name lingered in the air between them. Ethan waited. Eleanor smiled faintly. Strange name, I know. Samuel believed the creek carried more than water. He used to say, every river remembers the people who trust it. She paused. Most folks thought he was eccentric. Ethan thought about the message written on the map. The river remembers everything. Suddenly the words felt less mysterious. They felt connected. Before leaving, Eleanor reached into her purse and removed an old photograph. The edges had yellowed with age. It showed a younger Samuel Holloway standing beside the creek with several workers. In the background, barely visible among the trees, stood a stone outcropping marked with the same symbol Ethan had found beneath the floorboards. Take this, Eleanor said. Something tells me you will need it. By the time Ethan returned to the mill, evening shadows were stretching across the valley. The mountains glowed beneath the last light of day, while the creek reflected streaks of copper and crimson. Ranger jumped from the truck before Ethan even shut off the engine. The dog immediately trotted toward the water wheel. Ethan followed. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then Ranger froze. His ears lifted. His body became perfectly still. Ethan stopped beside him. The creek flowed quietly through the fading light. Wind rustled through pine branches overhead. Then it came. A faint metallic knock. Exactly like before. One sharp sound rising from somewhere beneath the earth. Ethan checked his watch instinctively. 27 seconds later it happened again. His breath caught. 27 seconds. The same interval. Again the sound echoed upward through stone and timber. Ranger moved toward the rear of the mill, following the rhythm. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and hurried after him. The dog stopped beside an exterior wall partially hidden by thick vines and decades of overgrowth. There, almost invisible beneath moss and weathered stone, Ethan noticed something he had somehow missed before. A narrow iron door set directly into the foundation, and hanging from its rusted lock was a keyhole perfectly sized for the strange brass key now resting in his pocket. The brass key felt unusually cold in Ethan's hand despite the mild evening air. For a long moment, he stood motionless before the hidden door while Ranger waited beside him, alert and patient. The creek continued its endless journey through the valley, whispering beneath the fading light as if urging him forward. Ethan glanced at the worn engravings along the key's shaft. They matched the symbol carved beneath the floorboards. Whatever mystery Samuel Holloway had left behind, it had been carefully planned. Taking a slow breath, Ethan slid the key into the lock. At first nothing happened. Decades of rust resisted the mechanism. Then, with a heavy metallic click, the lock surrendered. The sound echoed through the quiet valley. Ranger immediately stepped closer. Ethan pulled the iron door open. Cool air rushed outward, carrying the scent of wet stone and earth untouched by sunlight for generations. Beyond the doorway, a narrow passage descended into darkness beneath the mill. Ethan switched on his flashlight and began carefully making his way downward. The tunnel had been carved directly into the bedrock beneath the foundation. Water droplets clung to the walls and reflected the flashlight beam like tiny stars. Ranger walked ahead with measured confidence, occasionally pausing to listen before continuing. The farther they traveled, the quieter the outside world became. Soon the sounds of wind and water faded behind them until only their footsteps remained. After nearly 50 feet, the passage widened into a small underground chamber. Ethan swept the flashlight across the room. Shelves lined one wall, though most had collapsed long ago. Wooden crates sat scattered across the floor beneath thick layers of dust. His pulse quickened. This had to be it. The hidden treasure. The secret Samuel Holloway had protected. He moved toward the nearest crate and carefully opened it. Inside were old ledgers. Nothing more. He checked another crate. Then another. Maps. Accounting records. Property deeds. Years of business documents preserved in the dry underground air. Valuable perhaps to historians, but certainly not the incredible secret Ethan had imagined. For several minutes disappointment settled heavily over him. Then Ranger stopped near the far wall. The dog lowered his head and sniffed along the stone surface. Ethan walked over. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then the flashlight revealed a series of markings etched directly into the rock. Unlike the symbol beneath the floorboards, these formed words. Faded, difficult to read, yet still visible. Ethan brushed away dust with his sleeve. The inscription became clearer. The first chamber protects the story. The second chamber protects the future. He stared at the sentence. His disappointment vanished instantly. First chamber. The words implied there was another. Somewhere beyond this room. Somewhere deeper. Ranger suddenly pawed at the ground near the wall. Ethan aimed the flashlight lower. A narrow gap ran along the base of the stone. Barely noticeable unless someone was specifically looking for it. More surprising was the faint current of air drifting through the opening. Cold. Steady. Fresh. His heart began to race. Air meant space. Space meant another passage. Another hidden area. He examined the old maps recovered from the crates. Most appeared unrelated until one folded sheet caught his attention. Unlike the others, it showed no property lines or survey markings. Instead, it depicted a section of the valley's bedrock beneath the creek itself. A small hand-drawn arrow pointed toward a location farther beneath the hillside. Beside it, written in Samuel Holloway's fading script, were 6 words. The river hides what greed cannot. Ethan read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Somewhere beyond the chamber, beyond the stone walls and forgotten records, another secret waited in darkness. And judging by the excitement in Ranger's eyes, the dog had already sensed it. The next morning arrived beneath a blanket of low clouds that hung over Blackwater Valley like drifting smoke. A fine mist floated above the creek, softening the outlines of the pines and turning the entire landscape silver and gray. Ethan had barely slept. The words from Samuel Holloway's map remained fixed in his thoughts. The river hides what greed cannot. It felt less like a clue and more like a challenge left behind for someone willing to keep searching. Ranger seemed equally restless. The German shepherd paced near the hidden tunnel entrance while Ethan gathered supplies from his truck. Flashlights, rope, water, and a small shovel. Years as an army combat engineer had taught him to prepare before entering unfamiliar places. Underground spaces demanded patience. Mistakes beneath the earth often became problems much larger than they first appeared. By mid-morning they were back inside the first chamber. Water dripped slowly from the ceiling. The steady sound echoed through the stone corridors like the ticking of an ancient clock. Ethan followed the narrow draft flowing from the crack near the wall. Up close, the opening appeared larger than he had realized. It was not a natural fracture at all. Someone had deliberately concealed a passage behind carefully fitted stone. Time and moisture had hidden the craftsmanship. Ranger pressed his nose against the gap and released a low whine. Ethan set down the shovel and began clearing loose debris. Small stones shifted away one by one. Dust filled the beam of his flashlight. After nearly an hour of work, enough space had opened for him to see beyond the wall. A narrow tunnel stretched into darkness. Cool air flowed steadily through it. Fresh air. Deep air. Air from somewhere much larger. Ethan squeezed through first. Ranger followed immediately. The new passage angled downward beneath the hillside. Unlike the first tunnel, this one showed signs of extensive construction. Wooden supports reinforced sections of the ceiling. Iron brackets remained bolted into the rock despite decades underground. Whoever built this place had invested enormous effort. The deeper they traveled, the more unusual the surroundings became. Faint mineral deposits shimmered along the walls, catching the flashlight beam in scattered flashes of pale gold and silver. Several times Ethan paused, thinking he had discovered something valuable. Each time the glimmer proved to be nothing more than natural crystals embedded in the stone. The valley seemed determined to offer hope and disappointment in equal measure. Nearly 300 feet beyond the hidden opening, the tunnel widened suddenly. Ethan stopped. Before them stood a massive underground cavern. The ceiling disappeared into darkness overhead. Ancient stone pillars rose from the floor like the columns of a forgotten cathedral. A narrow underground stream flowed silently through the center, fed by water from Blackwater Creek far above. The sight left Ethan speechless. He had expected another room, another vault, perhaps even a hidden storage chamber. He had not expected an entire world concealed beneath the valley. Ranger moved ahead carefully, his paws clicking softly across the stone. Then the dog froze. His ears lifted. His body became rigid. Ethan immediately recognized the signal. Ranger had found something. He followed the dog's gaze toward the far side of the cavern. At first he saw only shadows. Then his flashlight beam revealed a wooden structure built directly against the rock wall. A small cabin, underground, perfectly preserved. The sight seemed impossible. Yet there it stood beneath the earth, untouched by time. Above its weathered doorway hung a wooden sign covered in dust. Ethan stepped closer and brushed away the dirt with trembling fingers. For words slowly emerged from the darkness. The second chamber begins here. The cabin seemed impossible. Deep beneath the valley floor, hidden inside a cavern no map had ever shown, it stood as though someone had built it yesterday and simply walked away. The walls were crafted from dark pine logs aged smooth by time. A stone chimney rose through the roof and disappeared into the shadows above. Dust covered everything, yet the structure remained remarkably intact. Ethan approached slowly while Ranger moved ahead, inspecting every corner with careful attention. The underground stream flowed quietly nearby, its crystal water reflecting faint patterns of light onto the cabin walls. The entire cavern felt suspended between past and present, a place forgotten by history but not by purpose. Ethan pushed open the cabin door. The hinges released a long groan that echoed through the cavern before fading into silence. His flashlight swept across the interior. A wooden table stood near the center of the room. Shelves lined the walls. A cast-iron stove occupied one corner. It looked less like a hideout and more like a home. A home someone had expected to use for a very long time. Ranger entered first. His nose moved constantly as he explored the room. Ethan followed. Everything appeared frozen in time. A lantern rested on the table beside a stack of notebooks. A coat still hung near the doorway. Several tools remained neatly arranged along one wall. The owner had not abandoned this place in a hurry. Whatever had happened here had been planned. Ethan picked up the top notebook. Dust drifted into the flashlight beam as he carefully opened the cover. The first page contained a name written in elegant handwriting. Samuel Holloway. Ethan felt a surge of excitement. At last, something directly connected to the missing mill owner. He began reading. The entries stretched across years. Samuel described the valley, the creek, and the construction of the hidden chambers. He wrote about protecting something valuable from men who sought only wealth. Yet strangely, he never mentioned gold, never mentioned treasure. Instead, one sentence appeared repeatedly throughout the journals. The future matters more than the fortune. Ethan turned page after page searching for answers. The deeper he read, the more mysterious Samuel became. The man seemed obsessed with preserving a secret, but equally determined to prevent the wrong people from finding it. Several pages referenced surveys of the surrounding hills. Others mentioned unusual stone formations beneath the valley. One entry caught Ethan's attention immediately. It had been written only days before Samuel disappeared. If anyone reaches this chamber, they must understand the mill was never the destination. It was only the doorway. Ethan stared at the sentence. The realization settled over him slowly. Everything discovered so far had been designed to redirect attention. The floorboards, the key, the hidden tunnel, even the first chamber itself. None of it had been the true objective. Ranger suddenly barked once. Sharp, focused. Ethan looked up. The dog stood near the back wall beside an old stone fireplace. His ears were forward. His tail remained perfectly still. Ethan crossed the room. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then his flashlight beam revealed fresh movement. A thin stream of air flowed through a narrow crack hidden between the fireplace stones. Not a draft from the cavern. Air from somewhere beyond the wall itself. Ethan knelt and examined the opening. The stonework was carefully constructed. Too carefully. He placed both hands against one section and pushed. For several seconds nothing happened. Then a deep grinding sound rolled through the cabin. Slowly, a concealed panel shifted inward. Darkness waited beyond. Ranger stepped closer and peered into the opening. Ethan raised his flashlight and aimed it inside. The beam disappeared into a tunnel descending even deeper beneath the mountain. And there, carved into the stone at the entrance, were 6 words that made his heart race. The river keeps its final promise. The tunnel beyond the hidden panel felt older than everything Ethan had discovered so far. The walls were rougher, carved directly through ancient stone with none of the careful reinforcements he had seen elsewhere. Moisture glistened along the rock face, reflecting his flashlight in scattered flashes that danced across the darkness. The air carried a deep mineral scent unlike anything near the surface. It smelled ancient, untouched, as though this place had existed long before the valley above ever had a name. Ranger moved ahead cautiously. His paws made almost no sound against the stone floor. Every few steps he paused to listen. Ethan followed close behind. The passage descended steadily beneath the mountain. Minutes passed, then more. The tunnel seemed endless. Yet the farther they traveled, the stronger the faint metallic scent became. At first Ethan could not identify it. Then a memory surfaced from years ago when he had worked near abandoned mining operations in the western states. Certain minerals carried a distinctive smell when exposed to moisture. The realization quickened his pulse. Ahead, the tunnel widened once more. A faint glow appeared in the darkness. Not sunlight. Not artificial light. Something softer. Almost golden. Ethan switched off his flashlight. The glow remained. His heart began pounding. Ranger stopped beside him, staring forward with intense focus. Together they rounded the final bend. Ethan froze. The cavern beyond was unlike anything he had ever imagined. Towering walls stretched upward into darkness. Veins of brilliant mineral ran through the stone in every direction. Under the faint illumination of naturally reflective crystals embedded throughout the cavern, the entire chamber shimmered with warm golden light. It looked as though the mountain itself had been filled with liquid sunlight. Ethan stepped forward slowly. His boots crunched across loose rock. He reached one hand toward the nearest wall. Thin golden bands traced through the stone in twisting patterns. Some no wider than a pencil, others several inches thick. He stared in disbelief. This was not a hidden chest, not a forgotten vault, not stacks of treasure stored underground. It was something far greater. The mountain itself contained a massive natural gold deposit, an untouched vein running through the bedrock beneath Blackwater Valley. For a long moment Ethan simply stood there. The scale of what he was seeing was difficult to comprehend. Generations had searched the western wilderness for discoveries like this. Yet Samuel Holloway had found it decades ago and chosen to hide it. Not exploit it. Not advertise it. Protect it. Ranger walked quietly through the chamber until he reached a stone ledge near the far wall. There, half concealed beneath a layer of dust, rested a final metal box. Ethan crossed the cavern and carefully opened it. Inside lay a single notebook, smaller than Samuel's journals. Newer. The pages remained remarkably well preserved. On the first page, Samuel had written a final message. Ethan read the words slowly beneath the golden glow surrounding him. If you are reading this, then you found what many would have called fortune. But fortune was never the purpose. Gold changes hands. It appears. It disappears. It builds and destroys. What matters is what you choose to build with it. The valley gave me this gift. I leave it to someone willing to protect more than themselves. Ethan lowered the notebook. Silence filled the cavern. Not empty silence. Peaceful silence. The kind that settles over a person when a long journey finally reaches its destination. Nearby, Ranger sat calmly watching the glowing walls. For the first time since arriving at the mill, the dog seemed completely at ease. As though whatever had been calling from beneath the earth all these weeks had finally been found. The weeks that followed changed Blackwater Valley in ways no one could have imagined. Ethan did not rush into town with grand announcements. He did not stand before cameras or seek attention. Instead, he returned to the surface carrying Samuel Holloway's journals, the final notebook, and a responsibility far heavier than any treasure. The autumn winds arrived early that year. Golden leaves drifted across the creek while the old mill stood quietly beneath. Clear Montana skies. Each morning Ethan sat on the porch with a cup of coffee warming his hands while Ranger rested beside him. For the first time in many years, the future no longer felt like an empty road disappearing into the horizon. It felt like something solid, something worth building. With guidance from geologists, historians, and local officials, the discovery was carefully documented and protected. Samuel's journals revealed not only the existence of the underground deposit, but also his reasons for concealing it. He had feared that reckless exploitation would destroy the valley he loved. Decades earlier, he had chosen preservation over profit. Ethan honored that choice. Rather than allowing outsiders to strip the land bare, a plan emerged that balanced stewardship with opportunity. New jobs arrived. Long-abandoned businesses reopened. Families who had once considered leaving the valley decided to stay. The old general store received a fresh coat of paint. The town library expanded. Scholarships were established for local students. Piece by piece, hope returned to a place that had nearly faded into memory. Through it all, Ethan remained the same man who had arrived with little more than a truck, a loyal dog, and a determination to keep moving forward. Eleanor Whitaker often visited the mill. Together, they spent afternoons reading through Samuel's journals, while sunlight filtered through the repaired windows. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence listening to the creek. Other times they spoke about the strange paths life takes. Eleanor liked to say that some places wait patiently for the right people. Ethan had begun to believe she was right. Winter arrived gently. Snow settled across the valley in soft white blankets. The mill's water wheel turned once again after decades of stillness, restored not as a monument to wealth, but as a symbol of renewal. Visitors traveled from distant states to see the historic site. Many came expecting stories about gold. Most left remembering something else entirely. The story of a forgotten valley, a hidden promise, and a man who chose purpose over fortune. One evening near Christmas, Ethan stood beside the creek, watching snowflakes drift through the fading light. The mountains glowed pale blue beneath the approaching night. Ranger sat beside him, older now, yet still carrying the same quiet wisdom in his amber eyes. The creek flowed steadily past the mill, just as it had for generations. Ethan listened carefully. No metallic knocks echoed from beneath the earth. No mysterious signals rose from hidden chambers. The strange rhythm that had first called Ranger's attention was gone. Its purpose had been fulfilled. He looked down at his faithful companion and smiled. "You knew before I did not you?" Ranger thumped his tail against the snow. Ethan laughed softly. The sound carried across the water and vanished into the evening. Above them, stars began appearing one by one in the clear winter sky. The valley seemed peaceful, whole, as if an old story had finally found its ending. Yet Ethan understood something Samuel Holloway had known long ago. The real treasure had never been hidden beneath the mountain. It had been hidden inside the opportunity to rebuild, to belong, and to give others a reason to hope again. And perhaps that was why the river had remembered everything. Not because it guarded gold, but because it carried forward the quiet choices of people who left the world better than they found it.